Josh is the founder and principal of Bersin by Deloitte. He's a leading mind and speaker and blogger and analyst in the HR space. And come on, I have to keep introducing.
I don't want to.
And you can follow him on Twitter at Josh_Bersin. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about what it's like to create an irresistible organization.
Thank you, Lars. OK, 5,000 people. I don't think I've ever spoken in front of 5,000 people before, so this is a first, even though there's only a couple hundred people in here. Everything OK?
Yeah.
That's my phone.
Oh, it's your phone.
Yeah.
Is there another? Oh, there we go.
Oh. OK, I guess the way to start this part of the presentation is I've been a VP of marketing twice. You can't market something you don't have. So the first one I'm really going to talk about for about 30 minutes is how do you build a great workplace to build great engagement, which will turn into a great employment brand. Now, the question I would ask you to think about is, what is the difference between employment brand and employee engagement? Is there a difference? This is kind of weird. No, they're actually the same thing. And I think what you'll find, if you believe what Robert said in the beginning, and I certainly do, that everything is becoming more transparent, your employment brand is going home every night and talking to their spouse and talking to their friends and talking to their neighbors and talking to their associates on social media that you may not be monitoring about what just happened at work today, and that's getting out there. Now, most of you are probably in talent acquisition or recruiting or somewhere in that part of the company. And what you really are is you're the canary in the gold mine. You're the one that's out there realizing that there's a problem in the employment brand, and you need to go back to the rest of HR and to the management team and say, hey, guys, there's some stuff going on here that we need to work on internally, because I can't go out there and recruit candidates because they're finding out about things in our organization we probably need to fix. So what I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this morning, maybe as an intro to the day, is what is that, and how do you really create this highly engaged workplace which will actually make your job as the head of the employment brand department, or the outreach part of the organization, much, much easier. And I like to call it building an organization as irresistible as cupcakes. And we like to call it simply irresistible. Now, before I get started, sort of the surprising thing about this problem is that it is a problem. If you look at the data from Gallup and you look at from many other companies, only 13% of the worldwide global, we okay? Okay, we got a lot of, is that better? All right. Of the world is highly engaged in work. As a matter of fact, 26% of the workforce is actively disengaged. That means they're going home at night and they're complaining to somebody about something that happened at work. And it even gets worse than that. If you look at the data from Glassdoor, and I had the opportunity, and I want to thank Glassdoor for giving me access to the data, to analyze a lot of the data in Glassdoor, most of the Glassdoor questions are 5-point scales. Look how low the average ratings are. 2.8 ratings of senior leadership, 2.9 in career opportunities. These are basically C or C- grades across the 25,000 or so companies in Glassdoor. And I'll show you a little bit about the distribution of this data in a minute. And then I want to show you what the guys at the end, at the tail, are doing. This is even scarier to me. Only 54% of the people who are using Glassdoor today would recommend that their company, that a friend or an associate come work for their company. Now, you could argue that maybe the people that are posting in Glassdoor are a little more happy than the people that aren't, but I actually think that's going away. That probably used to be in the beginning of Glassdoor, but I don't think that's true today. So this is a good indication of how big the problem is. So what do we do about it? I think if you really look at the workforce of today, and I've done a lot of research on this, we're really entering a stage where the reason engagement is such a big issue is really two things have happened. First of all, we're in a global economic recovery, so there are a lot more jobs. And the second is that most of the younger part of the workforce, which is really the bulk of the people that you're going to be hiring over the next 15 years, grew up with a different value system for work. And they expect their employer to have soul. They expect their employer to have mission, to have purpose, to do things other than just make a profit. And as a matter of fact, research has proven that if your company has a soul, it will be more profitable. If any of you want to get into this topic, I would recommend you read one of these books by Raj Sisodia and John Mackey from Whole Foods. And they studied what they call firms of endearment. And they found that companies that define their mission through their customer value or their stakeholder value, not just their financial value, were 8 times more profitable over the last 15 years than those did not. They were 4 times more profitable than the good to great companies that Jim Collins studied a decade ago. So this is a very important part of business today. The second thing I want to mention is this. I don't know if you can see this picture. We now live in a workplace of what we call overwhelmed employees. This is a picture of a guy with his cell phone and the dog collar keeping him from looking at it. In fact, just this morning on my way in, I was looking at another horrible story about somebody who got in a car crash texting on the phone. We have given our people too much to do, too much information, too many devices, too many conference calls, too many messages, too many emails, and we can't stop it. And I love Twitter, and I love all these tools. They are completely corrupting our workforce. And the research shows that only 8% of the companies we studied have an active program to help their employees manage the proliferation of noise, information, meetings, and tools they have to deal with at work. And that's affecting the workforce as well. In fact, one of the things that's really big, and it was kind of interesting to hear Robert's comment about Glassdoor, is this emergence of mindfulness and meditation and work-life balance as a really big theme in the workforce. And you'll find if you look through Glassdoor and you look through a lot of the ratings and comments, this comes up a lot. It's on people's minds. And if you're not dealing with this in your organization in a serious way, that is going to leak out into the market, and that is going to become your employment brand. Now, it's interesting. I work for Deloitte, and we're going to hear from Jen later. And Deloitte is a very, very high-performing, very demanding organization. Yet, the company has an incredibly good employment brand because Deloitte has been very effective at figuring out how to manage this and continuously work on this particular problem. Now, so for the next couple of minutes, let me just give you some of the tips of what really will drive a great engaged organization. And then you and the recruiting organization can take this and go back to the rest of HR when you go back to your offices and talk to them about some of these issues. So the real question is, if you look at the Glassdoor ratings based on recommendations, here's the bell curve. It's a 3.1. What are these guys on the right doing? I mean, obviously there's companies like Google and there's companies like Apple that everybody loves, but what about all the rest of those companies? What are they doing? So let me spend a couple minutes on that. So what we found when we looked, and by the way, here's where this research came from. I have been doing research in HR for about 14 years, and about 2 years ago, we got a lot of inquiries from clients about engagement. Do you have any research on engagement? Which vendors should I use? Which tools should I use? What are the drivers of engagement? And it turns out this has been studied to death. There are hundreds and hundreds of companies that have studied the factors that contribute to engagement. They've developed surveys, developed tools. So there's all this data out there. So what we did is we really canvassed probably 40 or 50 of these different models, including all the conversations we were having with leaders of HR organizations, and we brought this together. So that's what I'm going to summarize for you now, is these sort of major Uber findings. I guess you can't say Uber anymore. It's a brand name. Meta findings? Meta used to be a company. They're gone. So the first is meaningful work. It's funny. You guys talk about job descriptions. The problem is not the job description. It's the job. Is the job defined right? And is the job a meaningful job? And if it is, you should be able to communicate it. Sometimes it's not. So sometimes the problem is actually the job. Is it management? It turns out, as you all know very well, management is one of the biggest contributors of employee engagement. It is not the #1 contributor anymore. It used to be. There used to be an idiom that people leave managers, not organizations. That's actually not true anymore. The research shows that poor managers can definitely make your life miserable, but you'll typically often leave for reasons that have to do with other things in the organization than your manager, because today we have much broader spans of control. We work in cross-functional teams, and managers are a little bit less involved in your daily life than they used to be 20 years ago. The work environment. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. It actually makes a huge difference. If you believe what I said earlier about the overwhelmed employee, that's an environmental problem. One single manager can't necessarily fix that. HR can't necessarily fix that. That might have to do with infrastructure, IT, the buildings, the grounds, the facilities, the work, life, many, many things in the environment. And I'm going to go through each of these in a minute in a little bit more detail. Growth opportunity. Most of the time people leave your organization, the reason they're leaving is they're not able to grow in the way they want to grow next. Now that doesn't mean grow up. In most organizations, there are a limited number of very, very important managerial and leadership roles, and you want to get the right people into those roles, people that want those jobs. But today, we live in a world of what Reid Hoffman calls tours of duty. People want to advance and progress in their own way. In fact, I was just at a meeting yesterday at SuccessFactors where they unveiled some really interesting research, and one of the things this particular study found is the biggest fear we have now as employees is self-obsolescence, is getting behind in our own field. Think about it as a recruiter. How would you feel if somebody came along to your company and said, you know what, I know something about recruiting that this person doesn't know because I'm more up to speed on the technology, or I'm more up to speed on the practice, or I'm more up to speed on the market. That's going to make you nervous about your job. Think about a software engineer, think about a computer engineer, think about a salesperson. So the ability to grow in your organization is critical to engagement. And the last is leadership, trust in leadership. So let me just walk through these briefly, and then I'll wrap up and we'll take a couple of questions. So the issue of work, it's kind of interesting to me. I actually don't come from HR. I've been doing research in HR for a long time, but I never worked in HR. That we don't really define jobs. Management defines jobs, but we have to do all the stuff around the jobs. We have to recruit people into the jobs, and we have to train people for the jobs, and we have to figure out what would make the jobs better. And one of the things we have to think about is, are the jobs designed well? And there's 4 things that are really critical in the job. The first is, can the individual in the job actually contribute? The best example I can think of is when you call a customer service agent at an airline and you have a problem, and you explain whatever it may be, maybe you need a refund or you want to change flights, and the customer service agent says, there's really nothing I can do about that. That's just the policy. You're unhappy, and they're unhappy, and the business has just suffered as a result. We have to give people roles where they can contribute in their own special way. That means even if you're working in retail, in a retail establishment, we need to cross-train people. We need to give them flexibility to take the job and make it personal to them so they can add themselves to the job. I just read the most fascinating book over the weekend called Why We Make Things, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book by a guy who's a carpenter. And it actually, if you want to learn a little bit about work life, read this book. And he talks about why people go into carpentry and why they go into cabinet making. And it's really about the dignity of being able to add yourself to work. And that's really a very critical part of engagement. The second is selection of people. And this is where you guys fit in. It's really interesting that over the last couple of years, selection is not about skills and GPAs and experience nearly so much. It's about fit and it's about culture. And that's really what Glassdoor is about, is helping you do that better. Many, many examples of people that hired the employee that had the perfect resume. They came in, they were the wrong person. They didn't fit in the organization. And most of you probably know that. Small teams. People don't like to work in huge organizations. They work with 4 or 5 people. Lots and lots of psychological research shows that typically when a team gets bigger than 4 or 5 or 6 people, the relationships and the conversations don't work as well. Why are there most of the tables at restaurants have 4 seats? Because people like to work in small teams. At Amazon.com, there's a very famous quote from Jeff Bezos that if he walks into a staff meeting and there's more than 2 pizzas in the room, the team's too big. And that's true. And so you will find in your organization that the smaller teams are having more fun, they know each other better, and they're more highly engaged. And the fourth is time. We have to give people a little bit of extra time. We can't just keep plowing on the work. Research shows, again, in retail, that when you understaff to improve productivity, let's suppose you're a retailer and one of the things you want to do is reduce the cost of labor. So you're going to, maybe pull back on the labor cost, give people a little bit fewer hours, have fewer people in the stores. That results in reduced profitability because now you have people that are working too hard. They don't have time to take care of the store, take care of the customer. They're tired. If they have a problem at home, they can't necessarily take care of their kids, and that results in poor performance and poor engagement, and they're more likely to post some of that stuff on Glassdoor. So that's the issues on work. Management. I could talk about management for an hour, but I'll just tell you a couple of tips here, because you have some impact on management because you're part of HR. Clear and transparent goals. Most of us who have moved into management positions know that the first time you become a manager, you don't know what you're doing. Let's face it. The transition from individual contributor to manager or supervisor is not a new job, it's a new career. And we need to teach people who are in leadership roles how to be coaches, how to set goals, how to make success happen for others, not for yourself, how to define your role as enabling others, and how to deal with all the various issues that managers deal with. I was at a meeting. The meeting that I was at yesterday was absolutely astounding. As I was at a CLO panel, I had 4 CLOs up on the stage. I had probably 3 or 4 times as many people of this. And I asked, how many of you have terrific first-line management programs in your company? And I would say maybe 10% of the people raised their hands. This is a really endemic problem in organizations. Companies like Netflix who have a 6-week training program for new leaders, kind of get this. And then the final problem in management today is performance management. And I won't talk about that right now, but if you're in the HR organization of your function, of your company, there's probably somebody who's looking at the performance appraisal process and looking at completely redoing it. Because there's kind of a crisis that's hit HR over the last couple of years of trying to simplify and improve the problem of performance management. The third is the environment. I think most of us live in pretty complicated lives. If we're young, we're new to our career, and we want to go to the gym, and we want to have all our outside activities. If we have young kids, we have to take care of them. If we're older, we have aging parents. We may have health care problems of our own. Life is complicated enough without work being complicated too. And I really think what I'm seeing in the research, what we're seeing, is that we have to build a work environment which facilitates work, but is humane to human beings. So all of these wonderful things you see in Silicon Valley, we see the foosball tables and the ping pong tables and the nap rooms, and I saw the bowling alley down at Google, and yoga and all that stuff. That's great, but that's only 5 or 10% of the organizations in the world. Most companies don't have any of that. It turns out that isn't just nice stuff to attract people. That's part of making your organization work. It's giving people the flexibility and time to actually contribute. And if you don't have that kind of environment in your company, that word is going to get out. You can't market around that. I have been to some very traditional, very successful companies that have very poor work environments, and I won't mention any names, but it's a very important part of the workforce today. Recognition. I went to a conference this week at one of the leading providers of recognition software. Companies that recognize their employees through continuous small thank yous have much higher levels of engagement and much better employment brands than those that don't. It turns out when you say thank you to someone, you actually invoke a hormonal response in that person. They generate oxytocin and they become happier and more collaborative at work. So this isn't just a nice thing to do. It actually makes your workforce better. And of course, inclusion and diversity. Those are issues that go far beyond compliance, and they really are issues of your brand. Growth opportunities, I mentioned earlier. Lots of important things to do here. You have to tell the rest of your organization how important it is for every job, just like Lars showed you a minute ago. I think Lars, by the way, Lars' little recruiter panel is perfect. One of the 3 areas in there is how are you going to grow in this job? And I'll tell you, young people, and I have 2 young kids that are entering the workforce right now, the first thing they want to know is how fast am I going to grow and what's my career path in this company? And so you need to tell the rest of your organization that that is a critical issue, and not just leadership, in every role that you're trying to recruit for. And then having a learning culture, and that means really being an organization where if I go to work for you, not only am I going to have to perform, but there are going to be people around that are going to help me learn how to do my job well. And that is far and beyond greater than simply having a great training department. It's really having a whole learning culture in the organization. Okay, almost wrapping up here. The last one I'll touch on is leadership. Robert made the comment about transparency, and Lars, transparency is a funny word. It's amazing how big it's become. But some of the research I looked at, it's really interesting, and it shows that if you look at the Glassdoor data, I took this chart out, but I can show you the chart if anybody's interested. The most highly correlated Glassdoor question that correlates directly with whether you will recommend your employer to a friend is your sense of confidence in leadership. That is by far more highly correlated than work-life balance, than compensation, than career opportunities, and the other 9 or so questions that are in the Glassdoor database. People want to work for organizations where they trust their leadership. So your job in HR and in recruiting is to make sure that message is understood by your business leaders. You cannot market around that. If your CEO has a poor rating on Glassdoor, good luck, putting together a nice employment brand. It's not going to be easy. So I really think HR needs to be more bold and sometimes push back on business leadership and explain to them what it means to be an inclusive, people-oriented leader. Many organizations have those kinds of leaders, many don't. So that's the 5 keys, and I will stop there and open it for questions. My only concluding comment is that if you do these things, you can build an organization that is as irresistible as cupcakes, and your job with employment brand and communicating the employment brand will be much, much easier and much, much more powerful as a result. Thank you. You want to ask some questions? Or?
So I appreciate you leaving us with that delicious slide of cupcakes, so a little bit before lunch. I'm glad that you brought the data in a lot of this presentation. I think there's a lot of people maybe in the room or watching virtually that say, I want to build an irresistible organization. How can I make my organization become this delicious cupcake? Like, what advice do you have for somebody to kind of absorb this and say, go and do these 2 or 3 things to get you on your way to there?
Well, I think the number one thing is to face reality. Mm-hmm. And I think in many ways, you guys who are out there trying to do employment branding, you see reality. You're talking to candidates. You're looking at the commentary out in the public market. And you need to feel comfortable to go back to leadership and say, you know what, we got some problems in this organization. We got some problems in this management team. We have some problems in this function or in this department or in this city. And bring that information back to leadership. We're, in many ways in HR, we don't run the company, but we're really sort of the stewards of the people part of the company. And if we're not feeding that information back, shame on us. So I think that's number one. And then leadership's going to have to deal with that.
Let's take a quick question from Twitter. Allison, do we have any?
We do. We've got a question that came in from @CummingsMJ. He asks, do HR people need additional skills or backgrounds such as sales, communications, and marketing?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll just tell you my own, and all of you know how important it is to be able to do sales and marketing in the roles that you're in. I spent a lot of my time in sales and marketing in the real, in those real functions. And now in the last 10 or 15 years being in HR, I can see how important it is to package and position what you do and what we do in organizations clearly, both to the candidate and prospect market, but also to the employees themselves. Employees want to work for an organization that cares about them. And a lot of that is packaging information and communicating it effectively. So, really great organizations that I meet are very, very good communicators. And they have marketing people within HR that think about the messaging and the packaging and the branding that they're going to communicate inside to employees. And by the way, employment branding is not just for the outside market, it's for the inside market too. Your employees need to get just as much care and feeding as the candidates that you're out trying to recruit.
Okay. I've got one more. From, we've got @Skippy51219671. Skippy on Twitter asks, how do you create a performance evaluation regarding job placement?
I'm not sure I get that.
Skippy, can you elaborate, please?
I guess the question is, how do I evaluate the effectiveness of Placing people in the right jobs? What do you guys
That's
think?
what Skippy just said, yes.
I really think if you look, I mean, you guys all probably collect metrics on turnover and time, time to productivity. If one of your recruiters or one of your hiring managers has a lot of first-year turnover or second-year turnover, there's something wrong. They're hiring the wrong people, they're recruiting the wrong people, they're sourcing the wrong people, or they're not onboarding and managing people well. Again, one of your jobs as the canary in the coal mine is not just to bring people in the door and then throw them over the transom and hope they're successful, but look at what happened and see where it worked and where it didn't work, and then go back and recruit people that are more likely to succeed and feed that information back to managers. Most managers are not experts in recruiting, to be honest. They do it the best they can, and they learned it through their own experience. So they need the information back from you. So I think that is a flow of information both ways, where you look back into the organization and look what's been successful and then communicate that forward.
We've got time for a question from the audience. If anyone in the audience has a question for Josh. Anybody else new?
There's one up here.
One up in front?
We've got, okay.
I don't know about you guys, but I am hot.
Hi, so what advice do you have for a company that owns a lot of subsidiaries, and how does that company paint the bigger picture of their employer brand when they own 12 other companies that all have their own individual brand?
That's a good question. I mean, the question is employer brand for individual companies that are part of a bigger company. I mean, I think there's a strategic decision to make. Well, do you want one employment brand or multiple? So like I've consulted with clients that have made a strategic decision that have very important consumer brands that are separate, but they want an employer brand that's consistent. And the reason they want that is they want people to know that they can move between them. For example, GE is a great example. There's many businesses within GE, but when you go work for GE, you are part of GE, and you're going to have a career to move across. So I think there's a more of a strategic issue of, are you hiring people into the entire organization, or are you hiring them into these silos, which kind of gets back to this issue of mobility. If you have a strategy of talent mobility, you want to develop leaders that move around the organization, then you want to have a common employment brand, and that is the way you sell it. You sell it to leadership. You say, look, we don't want people to just work in Otis Elevator. We want them to go to Otis Elevator and then maybe move to Sikorsky Aircraft later. So we need to market ourselves as UTC, not Otis Elevator. That's a strategic decision about how we're going to move people around the organization. So whereas it may actually just be fine to have a separate brand, like McDonald's versus the other companies that they own, they may not want people moving around from brand to brand, and they may not want to do that. So it's kind of a strategic decision.
I think that's time for the session.
Thank you.
So, Josh, thank you.
Thank you,
Josh
guys.
Bersin. Thank you so much.